And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again, slow-moving front here keeps it wet over the southeast coast. This low tracking eastward dries it out over the eastern North Gulf Coast here, continuing to dry out south central Alaska. Lingering snow showers along the Alaska Range up over the eastern interior, but all this very light, and some light snow shower activity also here along the west coast. And not much going on out over the Bering Sea yet, or the Aleutians. And then high pressure shifts into the interior tomorrow. Light winds, dry conditions, chilly temperatures with still lingering snow flurries here over toward the eastern border. A couple of weak troughs bring some light snow chances. St. Lawrence Island across the northern Bering Sea into the Yukon Delta, Seward Peninsula. Another trough there with some light snow for the western central Arctic coast. And still slow-moving front, gradually shifting eastward tomorrow. Should see the rain diminish over the southern panhandle as that finally moves through. And then for the next day, pretty dry for the southeast coast, maybe some clearing, especially up north. Definitely some clearing here across southern Alaska. Not too bad over the eastern interior. Mostly cloudy, scattered snow showers back here over the west and northwest part of the state. Then big storm bringing storm force winds into the central Aleutians. Back to the Komodorskis there with a 943 millibar low way out here to the west, and a pretty intense front with that, slowly pushing eastward. And for the coastal water forecasts there for the central and south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow, west winds at 20 knots with 9-foot seas, otherwise north to west winds here for the north coast, 10 to 15 knots. Variable at 10 knots for the central and northern inner channels. Southeast 25, so small craft advisories there for Clarence Strait with seas at about 5 feet. And then for the day Sunday, small craft advisories, Lynn Canal, north winds 25 knots, higher gusts, northwest 15 here. Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, and west winds 15 knots for the central and south coast of the Panhandle. Seas running 9 to 10 feet, north to northeast winds on the north coast at 15 knots with 4 to 7 foot seas. Prince William Sound tomorrow, small craft advisories, north winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, north winds 35 knots, or 30 to 35 knots with gusts of 50 knots. Northwest 30 for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay gale warnings, northwest 35 knots. And Cook Inlet, light north winds 10 to 15 knots. For the day on Sunday, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots for Cook Inlet. Winds down to 20 knots, still from the north though for Prince William Sound. And north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Barren Islands, north at 25 knots, northwest 25 knots for Kamishak Bay. Kodiak Island tomorrow, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet. Variable winds 10 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Seas 1 to 3 feet, and light southwest breeze for Bristol Bay at 10 knots. And then for Sunday, still pretty light winds here for the Alaska Peninsula. Bristol Bay out of the north at 10 knots. Kodiak Island, north winds 20 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, west-northwesterlies tomorrow, 15 to 25 knots. Adak and Atka, northwest 20 to 25 knots. And then out here to the west of Kiska to Shimei and Attu, southwesterlies, 30 to 35 knots. And then on the next day, that strong low pressure area bringing good storm force winds into the western Aleutians. South 55 knots, about covers it pretty good here for the western Aleutians west of Adak, with seas pushing anywhere from 20 to 31 feet. And storm warnings for Adak and Atka, south winds 50 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings coming in toward Nikolsky. Otherwise, on Alaska Island, southeast 25 to 30 knots. Yukon Delta coast tomorrow, kind of a outlier here, east at 25. West 25 for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, southwest 15, west 15 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Light variable winds at 10 knots for the Pribilof, southwest at 20, 7-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. And then those winds, big increase of that strong front edges eastward there. Storm warnings for St. Matthew Island, south 50 knots, seas building to 16 feet. South winds increasing to 30 knots for the Pribilof, seas building to 8 feet. Southwest coast, south winds 15 to 20 knots. Small craft advisories, St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, milder southwest winds at 25 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, west-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, western Arctic coast south at 30 knots, south 25 for the central coast, and the eastern Beaufort Sea coast south to southeast west winds 15 knots. And then up that way on Sunday, kind of variable here at 20 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, central coast, and west side here, south winds 20 knots. And then for the Chukchi Sea, south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots.